the TPP report. Unfortunately, this report is Groundhog Day. Every time we see a trade agreement come through the parliament, we see discussions about economic benefit, we see discussions about ISDS, we see discussions about labour market testing, and we see recommendations for change. Excuse me. But nothing seems to change. Nothing seems to change in these agreements. I look at the TPP-12 report and I see that the economic benefit over the period of now to 2030 is something like 0.7% of GDP. Under TPP-11, it's down to 0.5. And we must remember, we must temper those figures with the knowledge that the Productivity Commission regularly has done analysis and has stated that these modelling results are often overstated, they're often exaggerated. So there is questionable benefit in respect of economic growth as a result of the TPP-11. Now, one would normally say, well, that's okay, we can still proceed because we're optimists and we do want to see us trading internationally. But the problem is the downsides. Senator Gallagher mentioned a number of them. I'll just mention a few. First is the lack of transparency. Time and time again we see reports come through that talk about the lack of transparency in trade negotiations and recommendations that suggest we need to open that up. And then time and time again we see the bureaucrats just continuing to do what they do. I'll read a statement from a book by Professor Clinton Fernandez, which describes this very aptly and succinctly, talking about these negotiations. A small number of DFAT officials and their counterparts overseas, along with a few hundred corporate lawyers and lobbyists, negotiate free trade agreements in secret. Once the insiders have agreed to the terms, they're presented to the parliament in a take-it-or-leave-it deal. Take it or leave it will remain the strategy of the bureaucracy until such time as this parliament stands up and says no. The same with ISDS. ISDS is highly problematic in my view for three reasons. What ISDS allows is for corporations to take legal action against the Australian government seeking compensation if the Australian government changes its public policy and it affects the business. That's what we saw happening, or an attempt in respect of plain tobacco packaging, where Philip Morris took the government to the High Court. The High Court ruled unequivocally that the parliament had got it right. They had made laws that were constitutional, only to find that Philip Morris then invoked ISDS clauses in a Hong Kong agreement so that the matter could then be heard by 3 lawyers, not 7 judicial officers of the greatest judicial minds in this country, 3 legal officers that could in fact have overturned our High Court. So it gives away our legal sovereignty. In actual fact, what we see happening in respect of these provisions is that it allows sovereign risk to be transferred from the corporate entity to the taxpayer. So changing our laws for public benefit, the sovereign risk transfers to the taxpayer. I'll make a second point about ISDS, is that the Australian corporations that are operating here in Australia, when there's a change of the law, they don't get the same opportunity. So in some sense it's discriminatory against Australian companies. And of course the third reason, which I've already touched on, is that it erodes our legal sovereignty. Another point that Senator Gallagher mentioned was labour market testing. Now, under this agreement we've waived labour market testing for contractual service suppliers for 6 signatory countries. That mean workers from Canada, Peru, Brunei, Mexico, Malaysia and Vietnam will be able to fill the jobs in Australia without these jobs being offered to Australians first. And what it does mean is we might get an electrician that comes in from another country to participate in a program, no labour market testing, and that electrician probably doesn't understand Australian wiring rules. So not only is it unfair to Australian workers, it may actually be dangerous as well. So my difficulty here is that we're, time and time again we see these recommendations made. Time and time again they are ignored. We just continue in the same manner that we have always continued. Now the reality here is that the Australian Greens, Pauline Hanson's One Nation and Centre Alliance have stated publicly that they will vote down the enabling legislation. They will draw a line in the sand. So, being very clear, the Labor Party, whose policy platforms reject some of these things we're talking about, ISDS provisions, they reject the waiving of labour market testing, they can be stopped. All that has to happen is Labor has to stand by its own, the courage of its own conviction and assist us in voting down this legislation. That will send a very, very strong message to the bureaucrats. And I know the Labor Party has said that when they get to government, and there's a presumption there, you may not get there. When you get to government, you'll seek to change these. You'll seek to change the agreements. Firstly, it's disingenuous to allow an agreement to go ahead that you will then seek to overturn in government. But I suspect you won't overturn it in government because there'll be some rhetoric, there'll be some discussions, the bureaucrats will advise accordingly, and as Senator Hanson-Young is pointing out there, it's actually become a very, very difficult task. There's well, you can withdraw. You're absolutely correct. You can withdraw, but it's not necessary. You simply don't have to support the enabling legislation, and then the agreement can't come into force. So that's what I'm going to. So this report it covers all the ground very, very thoroughly. Off the back of TPP12, off the back of J. Scott, in parallel with J. Scott. So the report's quite a good report. It's just the recommendations are Groundhog Day, they're weak, and the Senate needs to draw a line in the sand. Thank you.